Welcome to a story that would forever change how America viewed both celebrity and evil. I'm your host, Kieran Caldwell, and today on Spotlight Murders, we're diving deep into one of the most notorious crime sprees in history, the Tate-LaBianca murders of August 1969. Picture this. It's the height of the summer of love, but something dark is brewing in the hills of Los Angeles. A failed musician named Charles Manson has gathered a group of devoted followers, and their twisted vision of revolution is about to explode into unimaginable violence. This isn't just a story about murder. It's about manipulation, failed investigations, prison confessions, and a legal system struggling to comprehend the incomprehensible. Over the next hour, we'll explore every chilling detail, from the moment a housekeeper discovered pools of blood on Cielo Drive to the decades of parole hearings that followed. Love true crime that digs deep and cuts sharp? Scoob delivers fast, binge-worthy podcast episodes that unravel real-life horror, from deadly cults to unsolved murders. Join over 50,000 listeners obsessed with justice, dark history, and the stories that won't stay buried. Download Scoob now, available on the App Store and Play Store. Getting back to the Tate-LaBianca slangs, let me take you back to a seemingly innocent encounter which took place on August 9th, 1969, that may have sealed the fate of everyone at 10050 Cielo Drive. Shahrokh Hatami, an Iranian photographer and friend of Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate, was at their Cielo Drive home when he noticed something odd. A man had entered the yard with a peculiar demeanor, both hesitant and self-assured, as if he believed he had some claim to the property. The stranger was short, around 5 feet 2, thin with long, dark brown hair, unshaven but without a formal beard. He looked to be in his late 20s, though he was actually 34. This man was Charles Manson. Hatami stepped onto the porch and confronted the visitor. The man claimed he was searching for someone, possibly Terry Melcher, but Hatami didn't recognize the name. With Roman away, Hatami felt protective of Sharon and disapproved of this uninvited stranger inspecting the property. "You're at the Polanski residence," Hatami told him loudly and angrily, "and the person you're seeking is not here." He then pointed toward the back of the property, suggesting the man use the back alley, referring to the dirt pathway leading to the guest house. But in American terminology, back alley could imply a grim alleyway with trash bins, something that may have felt like degrading treatment to Manson. The man appeared upset but didn't respond. He simply turned and left without any parting words. Here's the chilling part. Just before this encounter, Sharon Tate had come to the door and asked who Hatami was speaking to. They both stood where they could clearly see each other, Sharon on the porch and Manson on the stone walkway, merely 6 to 8 feet apart. This marked the first known evidence that Charles Manson had indeed seen and been seen by Sharon Tate before the murders. After the brief encounter, Manson headed down the path toward the guest house, but returned soon after, spending only a minute or two away before departing. There was a notable discrepancy in the timeline. Hatami insisted the incident happened in the afternoon, while Rudolph Altobelli, the property owner, firmly stated that Manson approached the guest house between 8 and 9 in the evening. The logical conclusion? Manson visited twice, first in the afternoon when he found no one at the guest house, then returned that evening when Altobelli was preparing for a trip. During the investigation, Hatami was shown photographs of various suspects. He identified one image as resembling the man he encountered, though he couldn't be entirely certain. The photograph was of Charles Manson. It was only toward the end of questioning that Hatami began to suspect the man he'd spoken to that day might actually be the individual accused of orchestrating Sharon Tate's murder. Hatami's innocent direction to the back alley could have been sufficient to trigger Manson's animosity toward 10,050 Cielo Drive. The residents were quintessentially establishment figures in entertainment and film, industries where Manson had unsuccessfully tried to establish a career. Let me paint you a picture of the morning that would expose one of the most brutal crime scenes in American history. August 9th, 1969. In the early hours before dawn, just a few minutes before 5 a.m., a newsboy made his usual delivery to the mailbox outside the gate at Cielo Drive. As he completed this routine task, he noticed something unusual. A telephone wire had been severed and was hanging loose from the pole. By 7:30 a.m., Seymour Cott, who lived downhill from the address, also observed the damaged wire as he stepped out to collect his morning paper. Meanwhile, Winifred Chapman, the housekeeper, arrived for work shortly after 8 a.m. as scheduled. Chapman noticed the sagging wire and thought it might be a power line that had come down. But when she pressed the gate button, startled by the potential danger, the gate opened normally. She proceeded up the driveway, not giving a second thought to the white Rambler parked nearby. It wasn't unusual for her employers to have guests who might park carelessly. Instead of taking the path to the main entrance, Chapman opted for the servants' entrance at the back of the house. Upon entering, she immediately sensed something was wrong. The steamer trunks weren't in their usual places. As she investigated further, she was confronted by a horrifying sight. Streaks of blood smeared on the trunks, progressing into pools scattered across the floor. Her panic mounting, Chapman peered into the living room, glancing over the sofa only to find the front door ajar, and beside it, a lifeless body sprawled on the lawn outside. Overcome with terror, Chapman fled down the driveway. It was during this desperate escape that she finally looked into the Rambler and discovered another victim. Her frantic cries of murder, death, bodies, blood pierced the morning air, drawing the attention of neighbors who promptly called the police. At approximately 9:14 a.m., 2 police patrol units arrived under Code 2 classification. One neighbor provided crucial information to Officer Jerry Joe DeRosa. The film director Roman Polanski lived there with his wife, actress Sharon Tate, along with 2 friends. The property owner, Rudy Altabelli, was away, and a young caretaker named William Garrettson was also on the premises. With Chapman guiding him through opening the front gate, Officer DeRosa spotted the body in the Rambler, but chose to wait for backup. Officer William Wisenhunt soon arrived with a shotgun, while DeRosa carried a rifle. Together, they advanced cautiously down the driveway. They were joined by a third officer, Robert Burbridge. The trio crossed the lawn and uncovered 2 additional bodies. They noted a torn window screen, possibly an entry point used by the perpetrators. However, they also noticed another window that provided access to the nursery was cracked and lacked a screen altogether. It was through this window they chose to enter the house. Inside what appeared to be the living room, they discovered a gruesome scene. 2 more bodies, 1 male and 1 female, savagely murdered. They had been bound with nooses around their necks, 3-ply white nylon rope strung over a ceiling beam. The entire area was awash with heavy bloodstains and viscera, a picture of sheer carnage and violence. What the officers couldn't have known at that moment was that they were looking at the aftermath of one of the most meticulously planned and brutally executed murders in criminal history. A crime that would launch one of the largest investigations in LAPD history and captivate the world's attention for decades to come. Now let me take you inside that house on the night of August 8th, 1969, and reveal what really happened during those horrific hours. This account comes from multiple sources. The perpetrators themselves, including Tex Watson's memoir, Will You Die For Me?, Susan Atkins's confessions, Linda Kasabian's pre-trial interviews, and Patricia Krenwinkel's prison interviews from 2012. 4 members of the Manson family, Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, had driven to Cielo Drive with deadly intent. They climbed over the fence of the property, and it was only then that Tex Watson revealed his true intention to kill. The first victim they encountered was Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old who was leaving after visiting the caretaker. Watson shot him 4 times as he sat in his car. William Garrettson, the caretaker in the guest house, later recalled hearing what he thought were firecrackers. These were actually the gunshots that killed Parent. Inside the main house, Watson found Wojtek Frykowski asleep on the couch. Wojtek Frykowski was a Polish writer and friend of Roman Polanski. Also in the house were Jay Sebring, a famous hairstylist, Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folgers' coffee fortune, and Sharon Tate, the pregnant actress. Watson kicked Frykowski awake and announced, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." The terror had begun. Watson demanded money from the occupants, expecting the affluent household to be flush with cash. Abigail Folger, accompanied by Susan Atkins, retrieved around $70 from her room. Watson was displeased by the paltry sum and questioned whether this was all they had. Sharon Tate tried to suggest they could secure more funds if given time, but Watson interpreted this as a stalling tactic. The situation escalated when Jay Sebring moaned from his position on the floor. Watson, increasingly agitated, commenced a merciless attack, plunging a knife into Sebring repeatedly while screams filled the room. When someone desperately asked what their fate would be, Watson's response was chillingly direct. Everyone was destined to die. Patricia Krenwinkel, observing from a concealed position, believed Watson first attempted stabbing, then resorted to shooting, adding complexity to the sequence of violence. There's some dispute about Watson's use of the buntline revolver versus his knife during different moments of the attack. During this time, Frykowski, who had been initially weakened from an assault, mustered the strength to resist. As he attempted to free himself from a tied towel, Watson ordered Susan Atkins to kill him. A fierce struggle ensued between Atkins and Frykowski, with Frykowski managing to entangle his hands in Atkins's hair. Despite her attempts to stab him, mostly injuring his legs, he screamed and fought back, eventually slipping away to make a bid for escape. Linda Kasabian, who had heard the commotion from outside, moved closer to the main house. When she spotted Frykowski being pursued, she tried to intervene verbally, shouting a lie about imminent rescue to halt the carnage. However, Susan Atkins felt helpless to stop. Watson relentlessly pursued Frykowski as he faltered on the lawn, ultimately killing him with stab wounds and blows from the revolver's butt. Abigail Folger, seizing a brief opportunity, broke free and sprinted onto the lawn, only to have Patricia Krenwinkel overtake her. A violent struggle ensued with Krenwinkel attempting to kill Folger. Uncertain of her success, Krenwinkel called Watson for assistance. Watson, having dealt with Frykowski, focused on Folger, whose final words were an acknowledgement of defeat before Watson delivered the fatal attack. Inside the house, only Sharon Tate remained among the bodies. Susan Atkins stood guard as Tate pleaded desperately on behalf of her unborn child, offering herself as a captive until the baby could be safely born. However, the cult's mission dictated immediate impact. Delays were unthinkable. Atkins restrained Tate, while Watson inflicted the fatal stab wounds. In her last moments, Sharon Tate's cries were for her mother, underscoring the heartbreak and tragedy of the night. The presence of animals at the property adds another layer to this nightmare. At least 3 dogs belonged to Altabelli, and Sharon Tate owned a dog and several cats. During his testimony, caretaker William Garrettson offered vague accounts about the dogs, though it's established the Weimaraner was with him in the guest house when investigators arrived. Susan Atkins mentioned a dog inside the house during the murders, but police reports show no evidence of animals being actively involved. Garrettson's 1999 interview with E! Provides chilling insight into what he experienced that night. He heard screams and observed through a window as someone chased another person outside. He heard someone cry, "Stop, I'm already dead," but didn't comprehend the gravity of the situation and was too terrified to investigate further. There's notable dispute among the perpetrators about various details. Patricia Krenwinkel challenges Linda Kasabian's portrayal of her own reaction, claiming Kasabian was a willing participant who never tried to intervene or urge anyone to halt the killing spree. Tex Watson, who had consumed methamphetamine before leaving Spawn Ranch, may have had compromised recollection of events. One particularly eerie detail involves an American flag. Watson noted in his memoir that a large American flag was already present on the sofa before the murders. However, Krenwinkel was confident that during the brutal attacks, there was no flag on the couch where Frykowski had been sleeping. After the murders, Charles Manson himself arrived at the crime scene with an unidentified family member. His involvement in altering the scene is well established. He placed a towel over Jay Sebring's head, leading media to report that hoods were placed over all victims' heads, fueling speculation about satanic ritual motives. Manson also placed eyeglasses near the bodies of Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring as a misleading clue, particularly significant since he prohibited family members from wearing glasses. The Manson family wasn't finished. The next night, August 9th, 1969, they would strike again, creating even more confusion for investigators and adding another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible crime spree. The LaBianca murders occurred at a house on Waverly Drive in the Los Feliz neighborhood. Lino and Rosemary LaBianca were hardworking people who became unwitting targets of Manson's twisted vision. According to the accounts, Charles Manson, along with Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, Susan Atkins, and Linda Kasabian, drove to the Los Feliz area. Communication during the journey was limited and predominantly one-sided, as documented in interviews with Leslie Van Houten and Krenwinkel. The LaBiancas had been unable to drop off Suzanne as planned, making them available victims. Susan Atkins and Leslie Van Houten had dozed restlessly, having spent time partying on the same street earlier. Patricia Krenwinkel speculated that Manson initially intended to target the house next to that of Harold True before they left Spawn Ranch. Her theory suggests Manson hoped to entangle True in the murders as leverage for blackmail, though this didn't align with Manson's own perspective. There's some debate among chroniclers about whether Tex Watson was present with Manson when he initially bound Leno LaBianca with leather thongs. In his memoir, Watson asserts he was inside the house alongside Manson at that moment, with Leslie Van Houten and Patricia Krenwinkel entering afterward. The perpetrators left behind bloody messages at both crime scenes. At the LaBianca house, they wrote, "Death to pigs and rise in blood." Most chillingly, they scrawled "Helter Skelter" on the refrigerator, though this detail remained undisclosed to the public initially. There are varying accounts about who drove after the murders. Some records state that Linda Kasabian shared driving duties with Manson, while Krenwinkel claimed in an interview that only Kasabian drove, at least to the LaBianca's residence. The LaBianca murders would prove crucial to understanding Manson's larger plan, but initially, they only served to confuse investigators who struggled to see the connection between the two crime scenes. Danny Galindo, a Los Angeles Police Department officer, was deep in preparing reports on the Cielo Drive murders when he received a call that would complicate everything. A friend in the media informed him about another horrific murder scene, one even more gruesome than Cielo Drive, featuring a victim with a knife embedded in their neck. Before he could process this information, another call demanded his immediate presence at the scene on Waverly Drive. Upon arriving, Galindo observed striking similarities between the Waverly Drive and Cielo Drive murders. Despite internal LAPD directives discouraging media interaction, reporters had caught wind of the Waverly murders by monitoring police radio transmissions. When bombarded with questions about links to the 5 earlier murders, Galindo told a television journalist it seemed more like a copycat act than a continuation by the same perpetrators. This supposition was shared by his superiors and many others in the department, driven by skepticism about the likelihood of the same murderers operating consecutively in such disparate neighborhoods. Details about bloody messages at both crime scenes began circulating among media personnel. "Death to pigs" and "Rise" at the Waverly murders were reported, though "Helter Skelter" written on the refrigerator remained undisclosed to the public. By Monday morning, August 11th, Los Angeles residents read about a second set of grotesque murders in their newspapers. The coverage highlighted eerily similar bloody messages left at both locations. Initially, the LAPD linked the Cielo Drive murders to drug activity and deduced a potential motive for the LaBianca killings based on LaBianca's gambling debts. Estimates suggested he owed nearly $250,000, raising suspicions of mafia involvement based on information from a former business associate. Although these leads were thoroughly investigated, they proved fruitless, costing investigators precious time. The investigations faced significant setbacks due to the reluctance of respective teams to share critical information. The detectives probing the Tate case were seasoned veterans preferring traditional investigative methods, while younger detectives on the LaBianca case advocated for utilizing the latest technological advancements. Despite often working in proximity within the same shared space, effective collaboration between these groups was markedly absent. The LAPD administration showed little interest in facilitating information exchange, assuming the cases weren't intrinsically linked beyond superficial similarities, dismissing the notion of a single perpetrator or group being responsible for both crime waves. This investigative dysfunction would prove costly, allowing crucial time to pass before the true connections between the murders became apparent. Obsessed with the hidden confessions that cracked the case, Scoob dives into the dark minds behind history's most infamous crimes, from cult leaders to cold-blooded killers. Our short, binge-worthy episodes explore prison confessions, police missteps, and the unlikely heroes who bring the truth to light. Download Scoob now. Now, back to the moment when a Manson family member couldn't keep the secrets in any longer. The breakthrough in the Tate-LaBianca case came from an unexpected source: the California Women's Correctional System. Susan Atkins, one of the Manson family members, was incarcerated at the Sybil Brand Institute for the murder of Gary Hinman when she began making shocking confessions to fellow inmates. Virginia Graham was astounded when she first heard the gruesome details Susan shared with her. "You've got to be kidding," Virginia exclaimed, but Susan simply responded with calm affirmation. Virginia later estimated their conversation lasted between 35 minutes and an hour, perhaps longer. While some details became muddled over time, Virginia claimed she would never forget the core of what Susan revealed. Perplexed by Susan's calm demeanor and wanting to understand the motivations behind such horrific acts, Virginia asked the pressing question: why? Susan explained starkly that they wanted to commit a crime that would shock the world, forcing everyone to take notice. When asked specifically why they chose the Tate house, Susan's chilling reply was that it was isolated. The house had been selected at random, though they had prior acquaintance with Terry Melcher, Doris Day's son. They were unaware of who would be at the house that night. It didn't matter whether it was one person or 10, they were prepared to kill everyone present. Virginia asked if Susan and her accomplices knew who Jay Sebring or any of the other victims were. Susan answered no, underscoring that these individuals were strangers to them. Despite the disturbing nature of her disclosures, Susan had no reservations about answering Virginia's questions. Susan described how they left the ranch with instructions from Charlie, initially not clarifying this was Charles Manson. Dressed in dark clothing and carrying a change of clothes, they approached the property gate, parked at the bottom of the hill, then returned on foot. Susan's narrative detailed how they killed a young man first since he saw them. He was shot 4 times. The group then separated within the house, with Susan entering the bedroom where Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring were located. After leaving the house, they changed clothes in their car and traveled to a location with a fountain to wash their hands until disturbed by a man who began yelling at them. In an amusing twist, Susan claimed he was the sheriff or mayor of Beverly Hills, a comment Virginia found dubious. Virginia confided in fellow inmate Ronnie Howard, who was equally skeptical, questioning whether Susan might have gathered details from media coverage. They resolved to test Susan by having Virginia subtly extract information only an insider could know. Virginia's methodical questioning revealed specific timings of the Tate murders, the Manson family's philosophy of love under Charlie's leadership, and Susan's unsettling sentiment that stabbing someone could feel pleasurable. She also referenced additional murders in the desert, hinting at a wider scope of Manson family activities. One afternoon, Susan unexpectedly seated herself at Virginia's bedside, unburdening herself with narratives of future plans. She listed well-known personalities like Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, Tom Jones, Steve McQueen, and Frank Sinatra, describing how they would be executed next as part of a death list. Susan depicted herself in a starring capacity, claiming personal responsibility for stabbing both Gary Hinman and Sharon Tate, suggesting that beyond Manson, she was a central figure in the heinous acts. She ominously predicted further killings would occur. Despite informal codes against betrayal among Sybil Brand inmates, Virginia and Ronnie debated whether to report Susan's claims. The disturbing disclosures left Virginia wrestling between the gravity of her knowledge and disbelief at stories that felt too excessive to be true. Susan continued sharing chilling details with Virginia. When she exhausted the topic of Gary Hinman, she switched to the Benedict Canyon case that had puzzled police. "You know who did it? You're looking at her," Susan revealed with disturbing candor. Susan described how Manson instructed them to dress in dark attire, how they parked their vehicle a distance away and approached on foot. She recounted with unsettling detail how Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring were restrained with ropes, how she personally stabbed Wojtek Frykowski multiple times, and when he fled onto the lawn, they pursued and killed him. Most disturbingly, Susan callously admitted to tasting Sharon Tate's blood, finding it warm and sticky and nice. She revealed connections between the family and Terry Melcher, whom Manson resented for breaking promises, as well as interactions with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys and Greg Jacobson. On November 12th, Susan attended a preliminary hearing for the Hinman murder, where she learned she had been betrayed not by Bobby Beausoleil, but by Kitty Lutzinger. Upon returning to the dormitory, Susan threatened that Lutzinger's life was now worthless. As Virginia prepared for transfer to the California Institution for Women in Corona, the LaBianca investigation team at Parker Center received a call from Venice Police Department about another biker from the Straight Satan motorcycle gang they had detained, Al Springer. With Susan Atkins' confessions circulating through the prison system and reaching law enforcement, the legal machinery began to turn. The authorities recognized they had a potential key witness who could unlock the entire case, but first, they needed to secure her cooperation. Mary Bruner, another Manson family member, approached authorities in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, to broker a deal with Los Angeles County prosecutors. By agreeing to provide testimony in the Gary Hinman murder case, she secured immunity. Beyond her evidence about Hinman's murder, she insisted that Tex Watson had confessed to her about Charlie and others being responsible for Shorty Shea's murder. Mary informed police that Shorty's vehicle was abandoned in Canoga Park, prompting the LAPD to search for it. On the evening of December 3rd, attorney Richard Caballero presented Susan Atkins' taped confession at Parker Center for the investigative teams working on both the Tate and LaBianca cases. During a 2-hour session, as negotiations for a plea bargain were underway, Caballero let detectives listen to Susan's detailed account of the murders, naming the people involved. Susan made it clear that although Charlie Manson did not personally participate in the killings, he ordered the murders at Cielo Drive. She identified the quartet responsible as herself, Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. The following night, Charlie entered the Waverly Drive house and sent Tex, Patricia, and Leslie Van Houten inside to murder the LaBiancas. While Susan didn't witness the LaBianca murders firsthand, Charlie had sent her elsewhere with Clem and Linda. She later learned about them from Patricia and Leslie. Susan also mentioned that the objective of targeting the Cielo Drive property was to frighten Terry Melcher due to broken promises he had made to the group. In Susan's taped account, She presented a different demeanor compared to her brazen conversations with Virginia and Ronnie at Sybil Brand. She now claimed she only stabbed Wojtek Frykowski in self-defense, and that she merely held Sharon Tate as Tex stabbed her. Despite these adjustments in her story, prosecutors found sufficient evidence to consider a deal. Another lawyer, Gary Fleischman, was pursuing a similar agreement for his client, Linda Kasabian, who arrived in Los Angeles on December 3rd and was subsequently detained at Sybil Brand. Deputy District Attorney Aaron Stovitz had a brief discussion with Fleischman and discerned that Linda was open to cooperating, but her legal counsel demanded immunity for her testimony as a condition. Stovitz and Vincent Bugliosi, another prosecutor, chose not to offer anything to Linda at that moment, opting to focus on Susan instead. If negotiations with Susan fell through, they deemed Linda would be an acceptable alternative witness. On December 4th, Susan Atkins secured an exceptionally favorable deal. In exchange for her truthful testimony before the grand jury, the prosecution agreed not to pursue the death penalty for her involvement in the Hinman, Tate, and LaBianca murders. Even if she opted not to testify in subsequent murder trials or chose to retract her grand jury testimony, the prosecution couldn't use it against her or her co-defendants. Caballero boasted that Susan had profited greatly without conceding much. He pressed urgency by suggesting that due to Charlie's continuing influence, Susan might suddenly decide against testifying before the grand jury, risking the collapse of efforts to gain indictments against Charlie, Tex, and Patricia, who could potentially be released if key testimonies were rescinded. Stovitz and Bugliosi complied with Caballero's demands for Susan's deal and arranged for her to testify before the grand jury on December 5th. This legal maneuvering would prove crucial in building the case against Charles Manson and his followers, though it also highlighted the complex ethical considerations involved in prosecuting cult-related crimes where manipulation and coercion played central roles. To understand the true horror of these murders, we need to delve into the twisted mind of Charles Manson and examine what drove him to orchestrate such senseless violence. The evidence reveals a complex web of personal grudges, failed ambitions, and apocalyptic delusions. Central to Manson's ideologies and manipulations were his relationships with various people in the entertainment industry. Phil Kaufman and Greg Jacobson provided numerous anecdotes demonstrating Manson's ability to make cult members believe that the wicked deeds he envisioned were actually their own ideas. Manson's influence was pervasive and insidiously profound. The residents of Cielo Drive were quintessentially establishment figures within the entertainment, recording, and film industries, areas where Manson had unsuccessfully attempted to establish a career. This failure created deep resentment that would fuel his desire for revenge against the Hollywood elite. Susan Atkins revealed that the objective of targeting the Cielo Drive property was specifically to frighten Terry Melcher due to broken promises he had made to the group. Melcher, Doris Day's son and a record producer, had shown interest in Manson's music but ultimately rejected him, creating what Manson perceived as a betrayal. The family had connections to prominent personalities like Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, who had briefly taken Manson under his wing before growing wary of his increasingly erratic behavior. These interactions with the entertainment industry only served to heighten Manson's sense of rejection and his desire for revenge against those who had dismissed him. During the actual murders at Cielo Drive, the financial motive became immediately apparent. Tex Watson demanded money from the occupants, expecting the affluent household to be flush with cash. When Abigail Folger retrieved only $70, Watson was displeased by what he considered a paltry sum. Sharon Tate tried to suggest they could secure more funds if given time, but Watson interpreted this as a stalling tactic. However, this wasn't simply a robbery gone wrong. When someone desperately asked what their fate would be, Watson's response revealed the true nature of their mission. Everyone was destined to die. This wasn't about money. It was about creating maximum shock and terror. Susan Atkins had explained to Virginia Graham that they wanted to commit a crime that would shock the world, forcing everyone to take notice. The house had been selected not just because of its connection to Terry Melcher, but because it was isolated and represented everything Manson despised about the establishment. The choice of victims was particularly cruel in its randomness. Susan confirmed they were unaware of who would be at the house that night and didn't know who Jay Sebring or any of the other victims were. These individuals were strangers to them, making their murders even more senseless and terrifying. Manson's manipulation extended to making his followers believe they were part of a larger cosmic struggle. His apocalyptic vision, which he called Helter Skelter after the Beatles song, involved starting a race war that would ultimately put him in power. The murders were intended to be blamed on Black Panthers, inciting white retaliation and escalating racial tensions. The bloody messages left at both crime scenes, "Death to Pigs," "Rise," and "Helter Skelter," were meant to suggest political motivations and confuse investigators. Manson hoped these messages would be interpreted as revolutionary statements, masking his personal vendettas behind a facade of social upheaval. The psychological manipulation that enabled these murders was extraordinary. Manson had convinced his followers that killing was not only acceptable, but necessary for their survival and the transformation of society. Through a combination of drugs, isolation, sexual manipulation, and psychological abuse, he had created a group of people willing to commit the most heinous acts while believing they were serving a higher purpose. This wasn't the random violence of disturbed individuals. It was the calculated evil of a master manipulator who used people's vulnerabilities and desires for belonging to transform them into instruments of his revenge against a society that had rejected him. One of the most fascinating and frustrating aspects of the Tate-LaBianca case is the multiple, often contradictory versions of events that emerge from the perpetrators themselves. These discrepancies reveal not only the chaos of the night in question, but also the ongoing psychological manipulation within the Manson family, and the unreliability of memory under extreme circumstances. In his recounting to Newell Emmons, Charles Manson mentioned going to the murder site accompanied by an unidentified family member. Patricia Krenwinkel recalls meeting Manson and Nancy Pittman at Spahn Ranch's entrance, but remains unsure if Pittman accompanied Manson to Cielo Drive. Manson's involvement in altering the crime scene is well established, but the specifics vary depending on the source. He notably placed a towel over Jay Sebring's head, leading media to report that hoods were placed over all victims' heads, fueling speculation about possible satanic ritual motives. Additionally, Manson placed eyeglasses near the bodies of Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring as a misleading clue, particularly significant given his prohibition on family members wearing glasses. A notable dispute arises regarding an American flag. In Will You Die For Me?, Swing Tex Watson noted that a large American flag was already present on the sofa before the murders occurred. Vincent Bugliosi corroborates this in Helter Skelter, highlighting that housekeeper Winifred Chapman informed police the morning after the killings that the flag had been in the residence prior, though its exact location was unspecified. However, Patricia Krenwinkel was confident that during the brutal murders, there was no flag on the couch where Wojtek Frykowski had been sleeping. She was surprised by reports suggesting otherwise. Frykowski himself doesn't recall being entangled with a flag during the chaotic beginning when Watson was attacking him. This discrepancy might be explained by Watson's condition that night. He had consumed methamphetamine prior to leaving Spahn Ranch, which could have compromised his recollection of events. There are varying accounts regarding who drove after the murders. Some records state that Linda Kasabian shared driving duties with Manson, while Krenwinkel claimed in an interview that only Kasabian drove, at least to the LaBianca's residence. Communication during the journey was limited and predominantly one-sided, as documented in interviews with Leslie Van Houten and Krenwinkel. Among chroniclers of the Manson family, there's debate about whether Tex Watson was present with Manson when he initially bound Tate-LaBianca with leather thongs. In Watson's memoir, he asserts he was inside the house alongside Manson at that moment, with Leslie Van Houten and Patricia Krenwinkel entering thereafter. Patricia Krenwinkel speculated that Manson initially intended to target the house next to that of Harold True before they left Spahn Ranch. Her theory suggests Manson hoped to entangle True in the LaBianca murders as leverage for blackmail. However, this assumption didn't align with Charlie's own perspective. A significant dispute exists in the accounts of Linda Kasabian's reaction to the brutal murders. Patricia Krenwinkel challenges Kasabian's portrayal of her own response, claiming that Kasabian was a willing participant, albeit one who did not take a life, and firmly asserts that Kasabian never tried to intervene or urge anyone to halt the killing spree. This assertion is part of the larger tapestry of conflicting testimony that made prosecuting the case so challenging. Each participant had their own version of events, colored by their psychological state, their relationship with Manson, and their desire to minimize their own culpability. The sequence of violence also varies in different accounts. Patricia Krenwinkel, observing from a concealed position, believed Tex Watson attempted stabbing first, then resorted to shooting, a detail that adds complexity to the sequence described in Helter Skelter. In Susan Atkins's taped confession, she presented a different demeanor compared to her brazen conversations with fellow inmates. She claimed she only stabbed Wojtek Frykowski in self-defense and merely held Sharon Tate while Watson stabbed her, a significant departure from her earlier boastful accounts to Virginia Graham and Ronnie Howard. These contradictions serve as a reminder that even in the most notorious criminal cases, the truth can be elusive. Memory is fallible, especially under the influence of drugs, extreme violence, and psychological manipulation. The varying accounts also reflect the ongoing influence of Charles Manson over his followers, even during the legal proceedings. The discrepancies don't diminish the horror of what occurred, but they do illustrate the complex psychological dynamics within the Manson family and the challenges faced by investigators and prosecutors trying to piece together the truth from the testimonies of individuals who had been systematically manipulated and psychologically damaged. Charles Manson faced the prospect of spending his remaining years in prison, and from his first parole hearing in 1978, he approached these proceedings with a mixture of theatrical performance, philosophical rambling, and outright defiance that would characterize his interactions with the parole board for decades. During his initial parole hearing, Manson spoke at length for 3 hours, revealing his complete lack of desire to reintegrate into society. "I'm totally unsuitable for that world out there. I don't fit in at all," he declared. Despite this admission, he contradicted himself by expressing frustration at being incarcerated, claiming he was not guilty of any crime. Manson's behavior at these hearings was consistently theatrical. He gestured dramatically and mixed singing with his statements, declaring his identity with fervor. "I'm not your executioner. I'm not your devil, and I'm not your God. I'm Charles Manson." He acknowledged his lifelong involvement with the prison system, saying, "I was born and raised all my life in prison." He conveyed to the parole board that he had been invited to various countries, including Scotland, Germany, and Australia, but professed disinterest in venturing to those places. If released, he frivolously suggested he would retreat to the desert to live off the land and converse with animals. The parole board, citing the unimaginable nature of his crimes, denied his parole. In a display of flippancy, the following year, Manson conveyed through intermediaries that he had nothing more to offer the board and handed them monopoly money, along with a chance card instructing them to advance to go collect $200. His interactions with media covering his parole hearings were equally provocative. He suggested that reporters lived under more constraints than he did, boastfully comparing their rules to his relative ease in prison. To one journalist, he intimated a plan to show her extraordinary revelations if she helped him escape. During a later parole hearing in 1981, Manson appeared restless and confrontational, frequently disrupting proceedings by standing, sitting, pacing, and yelling at the parole board. He openly admitted to his fragmented mental state and the challenges prison life imposed on his cognition. "I ain't got no mind. It's gone, man." Manson detailed his entry into the prison system at age 9, asserting that his mental development was arrested at that early stage. By 1986, Manson opted not to attend his parole hearing, submitting instead a sprawling, cryptic letter. He framed himself as a misunderstood figure at the center of cosmic and criminal conspiracies, stating that he had invoked apocalyptic imagery and unleashed forces beyond earthly comprehension. His letter addressed the broader societal structures he felt judged him. "All of the judgments and the blame that is pushed off on me will be reflected back in the fires of the holy war that you call crime." Manson even reached out to political figures, writing to then-President Ronald Reagan with unsolicited advice about societal projections onto youth. He ended the letter with philosophical musings about global unity. "I've got all the thoughts for the balance of order and peace with a one-world government if we all are to survive." At his final known parole hearing on April 21, 1992, Manson continued his characteristic defiance. The swastika carved into his forehead remained a distinct symbol of his beliefs. He denied orchestrating any murders, claiming instead to be led by the young people he associated with. "I didn't break God's law, and I didn't break man's law," he insisted. True to form, Manson monopolized the discussion, his responses meandering through topics as diverse as historical figures, global conflicts, cultural commentary, and environmental issues. He asserted a fundamental cultural clash, referring to the governing board's world as matriarchal, a contrast to his perceived patriarchal existence. Surprisingly candid about details of his prison life, Manson mentioned earning money through autograph signing, receiving $500 per signature from external contacts. Despite his notoriety, the board deemed him unsuitable for parole, prolonging his next hearing to the maximum allowable interval of 5 years, slated for 1997 under the California Penal Code. Throughout these proceedings, a powerful advocate for justice emerged in Doris Tate, Sharon's mother. Following her daughter's brutal murder, Doris devoted herself to keeping Manson and his accomplices incarcerated by rallying public support. Her efforts culminated in a nationwide campaign that yielded 352,000 letters urging the parole board to deny Manson parole. Doris was vocal about her traumatic loss, frequently recalling the anguish of Sharon's final moments. Beyond advocating on behalf of her daughter, Doris co-founded a Los Angeles chapter of Parents of Murdered Children, strengthening the support network for those with similar experiences. Before her passing, Doris actively participated in international forums, representing the United States at the International Victims' Rights Conference in 2000 Stockholm in 1990. She also established the Doris Tate Crime Victims Bureau in Sacramento, which championed legislative reforms to enhance the rights of crime victims. Her legacy underscored the enduring impact of violent crime on victims' families and emphasized the need for a more empathetic judicial system. Through her tireless advocacy, Doris Tate ensured that the voices of victims would never be forgotten in the legal proceedings that followed these horrific crimes. Craving the real story behind infamous crimes? Scoob delivers razor-sharp, deeply researched true crime episodes that pull back the curtain on prison confessions, courtroom battles, and the relentless fight for justice by victims' families. Join thousands who refuse to settle for surface-level headlines. They demand the full truth. No nonsense, no pauses, just raw, riveting true crime at your convenience, wherever you are. Download Scoob now and explore stories that haunt. And now, as we draw this harrowing story to a close, let's return to the case that shook a nation and forever changed the face of true crime. It's worth reflecting on what the Tate-LaBianca murders revealed about our society, our justice system, and the nature of evil itself. These weren't random acts of violence by disturbed individuals. They were the calculated result of systematic psychological manipulation by a master predator who exploited society's most vulnerable members. Charles Manson identified people searching for meaning, belonging, and purpose, then twisted those fundamental human needs into instruments of destruction. The case exposed critical flaws in law enforcement coordination. Two separate investigation teams, working on connected crimes, failed to share crucial information due to departmental politics and professional rivalry. This dysfunction allowed valuable time to pass before the true scope of the family's activities became clear. The role of the media throughout the case was complex. While reporters helped bring crucial information to light, they also sometimes sensationalized details, contributing to public hysteria and misconceptions about the crime's motivations. The image of blood-soaked hippies attacking innocent celebrities became a powerful symbol that influenced public perception of the counterculture movement. Perhaps most troubling was how the case revealed the power of charismatic manipulation. Manson convinced intelligent, often well-educated individuals to abandon their moral compass and commit acts they would have found unthinkable under normal circumstances. The psychological techniques he employed, isolation, sleep deprivation, drug use, sexual manipulation, and the gradual erosion of individual identity, demonstrate how human psychology can be weaponized. The contradictory accounts from the perpetrators themselves illustrate how trauma, manipulation, and time can distort memory and truth. Even decades later, those involved couldn't agree on basic facts about what occurred, reminding us that even in the most documented criminal cases, absolute truth can remain elusive. The legal proceedings that followed set important precedents for prosecuting cult-related crimes and highlighted the challenges of holding individuals accountable when their actions occurred under extreme psychological coercion. The plea bargaining with Susan Atkins, while controversial, proved crucial in securing convictions against the primary perpetrators. The decades of parole hearings that followed demonstrated Manson's continued manipulation and the system's struggle to evaluate someone whose very presence in society posed an ongoing threat. His theatrical performances before parole boards were calculated to maintain his notoriety while masking the genuine danger he represented. Most importantly, the advocacy work of victims' families, particularly Doris Tate, transformed how the justice system considers victim impact. Her tireless efforts to keep the perpetrators imprisoned and to reform victims' rights, legislation created lasting changes that continue to benefit crime victims today. The Tate-LaBianca murders occurred during a time of tremendous social upheaval in America. The late 1960s saw the country grappling with war, civil rights, generational conflict, and changing social norms. These crimes became a dark symbol of the era's chaos, suggesting that the peace and love ideals of the counterculture could be corrupted into something monstrous. But perhaps the most important lesson from this case is about the precious nature of human life and the responsibility we all bear to protect the vulnerable among us. Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojtek Frykowski, Stephen Parent, Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. These were real people with hopes, dreams, and loved ones. They became victims not because of anything they did, but because they encountered pure evil in its most manipulative form. Their memory serves as a reminder that behind every headline, every sensational crime story, every true crime podcast, are real human beings whose lives were cut short by violence. Their stories deserve to be told with respect, accuracy, and recognition of their humanity. The Manson family murders remain relevant today because the techniques of manipulation Manson employed, isolation, the creation of us versus them mentalities, the exploitation of grievance and resentment, continue to be used by extremist groups and charismatic predators. Understanding how these psychological weapons work is crucial for protecting future potential victims. As we've seen throughout this exploration, evil rarely announces itself obviously. It often comes disguised as salvation, as belonging, as purpose. The young people who followed Charles Manson weren't inherently evil. They were lost souls seeking connection who encountered someone willing to exploit their vulnerabilities for his own twisted purposes. The case also reminds us of the importance of critical thinking, of questioning authority, and of maintaining our individual moral compass even when surrounded by group pressure. The psychological techniques that enabled these murders, the gradual erosion of personal boundaries, the normalization of increasingly extreme behavior, the creation of an isolated community cut off from outside perspective, are warning signs we should all recognize. In the end, the Tate-LaBianca murders stand as a testament to both the worst and best of human nature. They show us the depths of evil that manipulation and hatred can reach, but they also demonstrate the power of love, advocacy, and the pursuit of justice to create lasting positive change. The victims of these crimes have not been forgotten. Their memory lives on in the legislative reforms championed by their families, in the improved treatment of crime victims by the justice system, and in our continued vigilance against those who would exploit the vulnerable for their own dark purposes. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but important journey through one of America's darkest chapters. While these stories are painful to hear, they serve as crucial reminders of the need for compassion, justice, and the protection of human dignity in all its forms. Until next time, remember that the best way to honor the victims of violence is to work toward a world where such tragedies become impossible. A world built on understanding, empathy, and the unwavering belief that every human life has inherent worth and dignity.